Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have some interesting new guests today. I don't do that many podcasts anymore, but this is one I wanted to do because it gets to the bottom line of where I think we got to go in all paranormal phenomena, and that is to look at the consciousness connection. I'm joined today by Dr. Robert Davis, who is a retired neurologist who has written The Consciousness Connection: Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality, which was published in 2025. He's also published Unseen Forces Towards the Integration of Science, Reality, and You in 2019, Life After Death, an analysis of the evidence in 2017, and the one where we all knew when he came into the UFO field, the UFO phenomena, Should I Believe? He's joined today by Dave Beaty, who is an Emmy Award-winning producer and cinematographer. He is best known for his release called The Nimitz Encounter, which has millions of views on YouTube. Both men are passionate researchers who have dedicated time to explore the profound and often enigmatic topic of consciousness. Through their collective work, they have created a thought-provoking documentary called The Consciousness Connection that delves into the nature of human awareness, the mysteries of the mind, and the intersection of science, spirituality, and philosophy. The project aims to challenge conventional thinking and inspire viewers to question the very fabric of reality. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's always an honor, and it's a pleasure to me to talk about consciousness. So maybe we should start with a trailer. If I can share screen here, we'll do a trailer of the film, and we'll go from there. Um, Share. Have we got screen? Hopefully, we got the sound on this thing. Um, Hang on. Hang on. Try this again.
This
Oh,
is the Monroe.
this is a Monroe tape.
Another tape report from our Explorer files.
He was also a pioneer in cable TV and audio recording technology.
Bob became interested in sleep learning and getting into the right state of consciousness to be able to get to sleep faster, to learn faster. And so he started designing his own audio technology to help him relax.
When he was 43, Monroe's life took an unexpected turn.
And then this very odd thing happened to him where he started having out-of-body experiences, but he didn't know what it was called. He found his consciousness separate from his body, and he thought he was going nuts.
Shoot.
Curious episodes grew more intense. Then, the most astonishing thing happened. He found himself floating near the ceiling of his bedroom.
Looked around, and sure enough, down there in the bed below me was my wife lying in bed, and beside her was a man in bed. I says, "What kind of dream is this? This is a strange dream. Whom would I think of who would be in bed with my wife?" And I said, "I can't resist finding out." So I moved a little closer, and then this great shock came over me because the person in bed with my wife was me. And then the fright came, the terror. What am I doing? Am I dying? Let me get back quick, something. So I went through the air like this, swimming through the air to get back to the body. Bang, got back in the body.
Dave, explain the importance of that while I look up for the trailer here. Oh, you're muted.
Robert Monroe is sort of one of the forefathers of out-of-body travel in the 1960s and 70s when he arrived on the scene with a best-selling novel called Journeys Out of the Body. And in the beginning, he didn't know what was going on because they were spontaneous, and this would happen to him over and over. And In that scene there, he's reacting to one of the first times that he discovered himself floating in the air above his bed and not knowing how to get back and swimming. He says he was swimming through the air, and then he discovered that the guy in the bed next to his wife was himself. So that, from then on, he started going to doctors to start with, and then psychiatrists, asking them to diagnose him, to see if they could figure out what was wrong with him. And no one could find anything wrong with him. And so the doctors told him that if he wanted to find out, he's going to have to figure it out himself. So that's what he did. He dedicated the rest of his life to that study.
Beautiful. Okay, let's go to the trailer for your film here. Hang on. What the heck is going on here? Oh, I've got to share first. Hang on. As I said before, I usually have someone doing this for me, and now I have to do it myself.
What is consciousness? The mystery, because we don't know what we're trying to explain.
There's people that fall into consciousness and material.
Consciousness has so many different meanings.
The model is consciousness is something that arises from the brain that never made sense.
But if you study consciousness itself, you realize you need a bigger model. How does it connect us with our world, our universe, and life beyond?
Consciousness, matter, mass are all products of consciousness.
Our consciousness is capable of connecting with the universe. Psychic functioning is actually a survival mechanism. People have out-of-body experiences, from meditation to psychoactive drugs.
There are many researchers who have seen this kind of shift in our paradigm.
Science doesn't have to throw out religion. There is a way in which we're seeing in our lifetimes that these things are coming together. Will we break through the stigma of this science of the extraordinary and challenge the true nature of reality in the consciousness connection?
Beautiful. Bob, can you explain the process that was involved, how you moved from ufology? I guess both of you guys sort of moved out of ufology and went into the consciousness thing. Tell me the sort of how this movie came together, and why you did the movie. And just before I forget, the one thing I did notice, you had Eben Alexander on there, and it's now sort of been revealed that Eben Alexander had an alien experience during his event, and the publisher pulled it. So there's this connection that you move from ufology, as I did, to consciousness. Can you explain the documentary, how the whole process of putting this together and why it's so important?
Well, Grant, I wrote this book, Unseen Forces: The Integration of Science, Reality, and You. And while I was writing it, after I retired as a sensory neuroscientist, I knew it would become a documentary. Don't ask me why, but I knew that this would make sense to be in film. And I sent an inquiry to Dave, who doesn't live too far from me, and he found the book to be interesting enough to want to meet with me, discuss the possibility of creating a film with using the book as a foundation. And we did. After 2.5 years of crossing the country, interviewing people, from Gary Nolan at Stanford University to the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Nevada, California, to the Monroe Institute in Faber, Virginia, the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina. We went to the Near-Death Studies Conference to interview people there in Washington, D.C., like Jeff Long and Jeff Mishlove, and Bruce Grayson, among others, and conducted many other interviews individually. trying to capture this concept of consciousness, which Tom Campbell said it best. It's primary. Mass, matter, and energy are all derivatives of consciousness. And the hard problem, the so-called hard problem of consciousness, will always be hard because it won't be found in the brain. It's a subjective experience of an inner self, and it's beyond the reach of neuroscience to explain. And while we were working on our film, I wrote this book, The Consciousness Connection:
Holy cow.
Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality, which is based again on our efforts to document consciousness in all of its manifestations, why it's important, why, in other words, we need a paradigm shift. And that is I think, the primary objective of all of this. We do need a shift in our scientific paradigm from a materialistic mindset to one which embraces consciousness and the inner experience, the essence of life that goes well beyond the five senses. And we know that there is something that exists beyond it, and we see evidence of it, although it's subtle, in ESP, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, even the UAP is largely a consciousness-based phenomenon. Although most people still consider it a nuts and bolts phenomenon, which it is, but it is also consciousness-based in the form of downloads to people who interact with it. But consciousness is indeed primary, it's fundamental, and everything else is an extension or a symptomatic, a derivative of it.
Now you're in the neurology field. Have we made any move? Like you, Evan Alexander, maybe a couple others. Are we still stuck in that idea that the brain is this epiphenomena is being produced by the brain, or is there a movement in neurology to move in the right direction?
There are many more scientists, especially the younger ones, who don't view this long-standing negative stigma associated with consciousness, ESP, the paranormal in general, and they are beginning to do much more research in the area of consciousness and ESP beyond what we already are aware of. And you see individual professors in various colleges, not many still, but there are many closet researchers that are indeed very much interested, especially those in the academic arena who are experiencers. And there are many thousands. Many are afraid, however, to come out of the closet for fear of losing tenure, like John Mack did. But there are many John Macks out there, uh, willing and able to conduct research in this arena, and many are doing that. Many are turning it into documentaries and certainly books, but we still don't have the smoking gun, regardless of the efforts that's being made. But materialists, neuroscientists are still stuck in that consciousness is a symptom of wakefulness, a level of alertness. And yes, that is a form of bodily consciousness, but there is something that's much more than that. And that is the essence of human nature, the being itself. And we see again evidence that's presented in the film, and our future films will also illustrate evidence that shows that consciousness exists at the microscopic subatomic level, the observer effect, whether or not an atomic particle behaves as a particle or a wave based on observation alone. That's a form of consciousness. We see consciousness in the form of human to human interaction and human to physical system interactions. Um, and we see it therefore in ESP and psychokinesis. We also see it with the Global Consciousness Project. It's a macroscopic phenomenon as well, where random number generators are become non-random based on major global events where millions of people are focused on one particular incident like 9/11, which caused the random number generators to become highly non-random, 8 standard deviations beyond the norm. I mean, that's clear-cut evidence that there is something significant going on as far as consciousness is concerned in terms of its impact on physical systems, in terms of random number generators. But we also see it with, at the cosmological level, the Big Bang, 13 billion years ago, because of that Big Bang, I'm able to see you right now. The light that's emanating from the Big Bang is just now entering my visual system, allowing me to perceive. So, we're dependent on these external events, but we also have an implicit event. And that gets into David Bohm, which we can talk about, and his implicit, explicit order.
Yeah. Yeah, we will maybe talk about all the how quantum physics has sort of revolutionized and sort of moved towards the paranormal sort of world that we live in with all these weird things happening. I wanted to ask Dave first, what led you? You were pretty much into the nuts and bolts. The Nimitz 2004 famous Nimitz story got a lot of attention doing that. How did you make the move to consciousness? How do you think consciousness is important? And in the Nimitz case, is there any paranormal events where the consciousness was part of that thing rather than just sightings in the sky and stuff like that?
Sure, yeah. So, throughout my career, I've always been interested in consciousness and, life after death and the human soul. Those questions have always been a mystery to me, and I've always tried to understand, the nature of reality and the nature of the planet Earth and humanity and all living creatures here. I wasn't brought up extremely religious or in that framework, so I was given a lot of leeway as a young man, as a child actually, to explore different belief systems and trying to look at all these different ideologies that in some ways had similar themes, but sometimes they were divergent. Not understanding that as a child, like, well, how come there's all these religions and they don't necessarily all line up to the same belief system? So, as I got older, I did a lot of reading, and I was always interested in it, but I did sort of gravitate towards UFO mystery, which had a lot of physical evidence and a lot of observational evidence that I found fascinating, because when you introduce radar or film and video and photography and that sort of thing, along with multiple witnesses to these events, it creates a very strong case. And so I became interested in trying to look at those cases. And then as new ones would emerge on the scene, like the Nimitz, in sort of real time began unfolding in front of us, I quickly created these user groups that attracted a lot of people with a like mindset that began to discuss and debate these things. And that kind of snowballed into creating a simulation of what the fighter pilots in 2004 were witnessing. That in turn brought in a bunch of witnesses that learned of what I was doing and came to me basically out of the woodwork, so to speak, and began talking to me. And from that, I started learning a lot more about this case that goes way beyond the headlines of just fighter pilots seeing a Tic Tac, a white capsule-shaped UFO, and then landing in end of story. There was all this other material that didn't really fit into that narrative. And one of the gentlemen that was on the cruiser that was alongside Nimitz had a very unusual experience throughout the event. His name is Kevin Day, and you see him in my film. Some of the material that he began relating to me was, as Bob mentioned, a download, as people call that today, where he felt that as he observed these unknown objects, that he was given this very highly technical information directly at a distance. And to this day, he still maintains that. A lot of the other witnesses had nothing like that occur to them, but he had several very unique and interesting experiences. He wrote about it in his own book that you can find actually for free. It's on Amazon too, called A Sailor's Anthology by Kevin Day, that he talks about those experiences back then. But anyways, I was sort of interested in all these topics, and Bob randomly contacted me. I didn't know Bob. He just, I guess, looked on Google for video guys that were near him. You know, he just Googled video editor or something, and I popped up. So he called me, and I remember that one of that first conversations, I said, "Hey, Bob, you know, if this is meant to be, since we don't have any money, you know, you want to make a film, you don't have any money. That's the age-old story." I said, you know, maybe unseen forces will come to our aid. You know, that, and I didn't know. And then he sent me his book, and I kind of freaked out when I looked at the title, called Unseen Forces. And I, wow, Bob, maybe it was meant to be.
Wow. Another question about because you were into the whole the Nimitz thing. What do you think's actually going on? One of the biggest things, I've been in this for 50 years as of this coming May, and the biggest number of questions I got was about what's with the New Jersey drones. You get all the people that never wanted to talk to you about UFOs. Suddenly the New Jersey drones happen, and everybody's asking me, you know, phoning me up, and what's with the story? What do you think's going on? So let me ask you, what do you think's going on, like with the Nimitz? Like, what was this all about? Why were they there? What's the UFO? Like, why are they showing up? And is it messaging, or what do you think's actually going on once you get past the fact that, yeah, this is not us, this is not the Chinese, this is not the Russians? What do you think deep down is the purpose of what they did with the Nimitz?
I could make a pretty good argument that it is us. You know, I mean, some people would disagree and you know, debate me all day long about that, because I'm on the fence about it. I can't explain it, but I think it was around December 2019 when drones started appearing over Nebraska and Colorado. And this went on for about a month, still unexplained. In a lot of cases, the descriptions of these drones were very similar to what was described in New Jersey by not only the public, but also law enforcement that were eyewitnesses to seeing these objects. In a lot of cases that, you know, reflect back on these drone incursions, you have things that don't make sense if it was a foreign adversary conducting surveillance or signal intelligence used, you know, on military ranges, for instance. Mm-hmm. And that is that they would use lights. And in some cases, they would use spotlights. So these objects might fire a spotlight onto the ground. The Palo Verde nuclear power station incursions that occurred, they observed these objects flying over the area that was secured from flight and shining lights down. Now, you might think that, okay, well, that could be some type of technology used to film or do LiDAR mapping or something like that. But it's pretty unusual. This also occurred in July of 2019 in Southern California operations area in the same water that the Nimitz encounter happened. In July 2019, a bunch of Navy destroyers were out there, and they were swarmed almost every night for the whole month. And the objects would approach the vessels and fly around the ships. And occasionally they would hover over the ship and fire a white spotlight onto the deck. This is in the deck logs that I had received via FOIA from the Navy, and it's a play-by-play, very intriguing story. I haven't personally conducted research on the New Jersey drones, but I'm sure that if I did, I'd probably find a lot of similarities.
Interesting. Now, Bob, you talked about this idea of Bohm and all the quantum physics guys. Can we sort of go a little bit through that, a little review for people to give the idea that we're not alone anymore, that a lot of the stuff that's in the realms of quantum physics seem to match with consciousness and with paranormal phenomena like UFOs?
Well, Bohm, noted physicist David Bohm, talked about the implicate order, the locality, causality, but he talked also about the 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 basis for how the implicate order can evoke a sense of wonder that it activates, in a sense, our subconscious mind, almost like an ego dissolution. He actually expands on the implicate order of his theory, contending that entities historically referred to maybe as gods are communicating with us through quantum entanglement, where distance is not an impeding factor, and that people are actually receiving downloaded messages from intelligent beings from all over the galaxy. And so when you have a physicist like him, and he's not necessarily alone in this, and you start comparing his theory to the data that I'm familiar with when I was a member of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation for Extraordinary Experiences, that's what turned me on to consciousness. As a scientist, I was always interested in UFOs ever since I was a child, but I was also a materialist, focusing on my research efforts. But once I became a member of Free, and we did that study on over 3,000 individuals, a survey study, a complex array of over 500 questions that covered the psychology, the physicality, the attitudinal aspect of the interactions that people are claiming to have. It became apparent to me that the data are overwhelming and telling us that at least three-quarters of those individuals who claim to interact with this phenomenon, whether it be a UAP or a non-human intelligence associated with the UAP, is largely a non-physical event. About 1/4 of the time, people claim to be relocated from one location to another in the form of an abduction, physical abduction experience, but the vast majority consider themselves contactees, where they receive downloaded messages. And in fact, about 75% of our subject population claimed to receive downloads. Half of it was about science and technology. The other half was spiritual in nature. And what's interesting, Grant, is that relates to a recent study that my colleague and good friend, Russ Scalpone, who also was a member of Free with me and wrote that article that of our study in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, he just did a study on the Phoenix Lights. The Phoenix Lights Experiences Survey study of 115 people who experienced that mile-wide UFO that covered 4 states back in March of '97, I believe, seen by millions of people. And in his analysis, the similarities between that data and the Free data were remarkable because these people also had attitudinal changes. They became more humane. They became more of a believer in a supreme being and a deity. They they became much more compassionate, sympathetic, believe in life after death. Um, um, and they're like any awe-inspiring event, they question the nature of reality, but they tend to feel that they have a better understanding of themselves. Yet it sends them down the rabbit hole. How could it not? They're in awe, like having a near-death or out-of-body experience. The same thing happens. It's not necessarily unique to the UAP. Any ego dissolution type of extraordinary human experience has that tendency to change people's attitudes tremendously. And we see this overwhelmingly in those who interact with the phenomenon. Thus is largely a non-physical one because these individuals are saying that they are changed dramatically. And people in their arena, in their family, note these changes. Many even divorce as a result of being changed psychospiritually from these instances and become experiencer or paranormal prone personalities. I think Kenneth Ring, a psychologist, noted that label, indicating that there are many people who simply are antennas for these kinds of phenomena and downloads, interacting with UAPs and orbs and ESP. So some people, for some reason, have these experiences while others do not.
Yeah. I'll put myself among that. I had my download experience February 26, 2012, that moved me away from nuts and bolts and presidents and stuff. A week before Ray Hernandez's dog got healed, a week before. And mine was clear as day. This has to do with consciousness. Came with absolute certainty. I walked around for 2 days, with my head spinning. I really didn't know what it meant. But I'm glad you brought up and then do you bring it up in the documentary? Because the Free Foundation stuff that Edgar Mitchell and you guys did, I think is the most ignored evidence there possibly is. I mean, I did a whole book on flying the craft. 14% of people say they've flown the craft, and 37% say they've had near-death experiences. Kathy Marden's study showed 55% of people who are experiencers, UFO experiencers, have had a near-death experience, and most of the ones I've met have had two near-death experiences. And you go, do you think this is random? That's the material, 80% out-of-body experiences, all this kind of stuff where you just shake your head when you see that and say, why is this stuff being ignored? Did you bring this stuff up in your documentary, or is it going to be in the second documentary? This bizarre connection between all these paranormal phenomena that it seems to be almost like the idea that Ray got was you got to quit parsing this stuff. It's all the same thing.
Well, it's going to be in one documentary, whether or not it's the next or the one after that. I don't know, but we are going to address the UAP. Ray, who is a very good friend of mine, when I was a member of
Yeah.
Free, he had that download experience while driving his car in Miami.
Yeah.
And you know the story. All of a sudden, he's on board a craft and being told that here's a spokes on a wheel, and these spokes represent various phenomena, but they're all interrelated. UAP, near death, out of body. Uh, they're all interrelated in the terms of consciousness that prevails. And that's the brand of Free was that Navy steering wheel that represented what he saw when he had his download or was told by a gray actually on board his ship while he was going to work. Um, and that's why he advocated that consciousness is the fundamental foundation for all of these phenomena. He's not unique in saying that. Many people before him have expressed that, but you are right. This study, this Free study, the MUFON experiences study, and now the Phoenix Lights study, which is going to be published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, have many similarities. And I wrote a paper on it and submitted it to the Journal of Scientific Exploration just recently, noting the similarities among these three different studies. And it's heterogeneous. It's because the Phoenix Lights is a response of 115 people to one mass sighting, in contrast to Free, which wasn't a mass sighting, but rather individual sightings by thousands of people. Same with MUFON. Um, but the remarkable similarities, the main one to me was the spirituality aspect of it and the increase in spiritual beliefs, the appreciation of nature, concern for the welfare of the planet, an increase in the inner spiritual life and connection with others, a decrease concern for wealth and fame and power. This is all being expressed in all of these three different studies. So, what does that mean? That's consciousness. This phenomenon, as remarkable as it is, exceeding 100,000 miles per hour, thousands of Gs, as Kenneth Knuth reported from the University of Albany, a physicist who analyzed the Nimitz Tic Tac. And he contends that the speeds that these things fly, can achieve relativistic velocities that can visit planets, within our galaxy in no time. So he was convinced that it's a physical phenomenon, as most people are coming around to believe, but they're behind the curve. All we keep on hearing about are documentaries coming out and whistleblowers coming out reporting what the remarkable things that they're hearing, although there's no solid physical evidence or smoking gun, as far as I'm concerned, yet. But because we're not going to be able to find that smoking gun. Maybe someday we will. Maybe it'll land on the White House lawn. I doubt it, but because it is a non-physical phenomenon largely. It exists in the minds of those who interact with the phenomenon and are changed from that moment going forward, like you.
Yeah. Do you believe, let me ask you, both of you, in terms of, are we making progress? Because I always remind young researchers who came in after the 2017 New York Times article to remind them that it's not the same world it was in 1975 when I had my sighting. It was basically then it was landing traces that don't happen anymore. It was a couple of UFOs flying around, a couple of what we call ground lights, which were orbs that were around the ground. But it's a completely different world than it was in 1975, especially when you start looking at the consciousness thing and all that kind of stuff. So do you believe that we're sort of making some headway now in terms of, are we on the cusp of the moving this phenomena? And is the phenomena involved, or maybe what do you think the phenomena is? Because I just wrote my fourth disclosure book, and I got a message clear as day that said, "Don't worry about this. Quit worrying. Don't worry. We know how to land the plane." It's like they're in charge and they're gonna do this, and they've done it on 1,000 planets before, and they know exactly how to move this phenomena down and get people to learn and get down the rabbit hole. So do you think we're making any progress? I can ask both of you that.
I'll interject. Yeah, I mean, there's been tremendous progress. The topic was in the closet, so to speak, in the 70s. I mean, it was difficult to have a conversation, in open company without somebody thinking you were a kook or whatever. So that was a big stigma against people talking about it. But I think today with social media, that's really helped. And these big, huge cases that have kind of emerged since 2017 in the New York Times article, we have 60 minutes covering the topic, which, was incredible to kind of approach it from a journalism standpoint without the tongue-in-cheek aspect. Basically, asking serious questions, presenting witnesses that are probably some of our top-tier observers, really, and showcasing that to the public. I think that was the impetus to begin having these congressional hearings where these men and women could step forward and discuss this and say, this really happened and we should try to get to the bottom of it. There really is something going on. It really could possibly be a threat to civil aviation. Obviously, military aviation is encountering these things. No one seems to be doing anything about it. But then the other part of it is you had people coming forward saying, well, there's secret aspects of this phenomenon that are well known by our government and are being hidden. And I saw the evidence. David Grush, was basically, according to what he said, privy to this information. So he was able to come forward and reveal that this material is out there. It's hidden under classified stovepipes. So will some of that begin to come out? I sure hope so, but people are talking about it. And I think more and more people in the academic community as well say, well, there's got to be something there. There seems to be a smoking gun, as Bob said. So I think the ball is rolling.
The stigma still exists. It is lessening to some extent insofar as the nuts and bolts reality is concerned. But regarding the non-physical aspect of it, the downloads that we're talking about, the more important aspect in my mind of the phenomenon is not being addressed at all. So we're really skirting the issue in a way, although it's good that politicians are asking the right questions and whistleblowers are coming forward, attesting that we have reverse engineered captured craft, and we have bodies that are extraterrestrial in nature. Well, we don't. It's anecdotal. So there's going to be skeptics that are going to jump on that and not take it seriously. But nevertheless, the increase in exposure of this information in all media forms are reducing the stigma associated with UAPs. But I don't have to tell you, Grant, J. Allen Hynek, who led Project Blue Book, Grudge, Sign, back in, was it 1968? He spoke to a subcommittee hearing, and he said that this phenomenon is both physical and mental, and so far into our terrestrial mode of thought. Back then, he knew after studying the phenomenon, he was a nuts and bolts guy, initially a non-believer, then a nuts and bolts believer, and then he started to realize that there's a consciousness component to this phenomenon. Jacques Vallée obviously discusses it extensively in many of his books, although he recently said that he estimates that over the last several years there have been 3 million UFO landings. How he comes to that conclusion, I'm not entirely sure. 3 million landings, implying to him that this phenomenon must be native to Earth, like another species. And we identify 150 new species every year, and maybe this is just another one that's interacting with us, leading us spiritually in the right direction, and becoming a little bit more overt in their presence, especially when we start playing around with nuclear weapons since World War II and thereafter. Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, went through hell after he claimed that people who are healthy psychologically were being truthful in their reports of being not abducted, but having interactions psychologically, consciously with these beings. And he says the similarity of the reports without them communicating among themselves were remarkable. And that was more meaningful to him than anything else. These individuals, of course, that come forward have nothing to gain by doing so. But when asked, they're willing to do so under the right circumstances. And when they do, it is alarming in the sense that They are they have no psychopathologies. Their recall of the incidents are as real to them as as if they were speaking to a member of their own family. That's how real the experience is. So there are many open-minded, skeptical scientists still that are coming to terms, I think, with the realization that this stigma is reducing, that it is that they don't necessarily have to hide behind their belief in UFOs anymore. And we don't have to, we all understand that top military political leaders are advocating for the presence of this phenomenon. We know it exists. That's not the issue, of course. The issue, I think, is how it behaves in terms of its interaction with humans and what it does to people in the process.
Okay. Now, I've done, as I mentioned, I did a book on 36 witnesses who had claimed to have flown the craft, and I've got a number of new ones now. And you went through about 40 witnesses. You talked to experts on consciousness all over the country. Have you run up against any people who indicate that the government is working on this consciousness problem, that they've realized there's this connection and they're trying to solve it? You now know that this whistleblowers come forward and talked about psionics, which is basically just CE5. And the Mission Rama people were doing this since 1974, bringing in crafts by making mental contact with them and stuff like that. And now I just did an interview, which seems to, if true, shows the complexity of this thing, that all the people that I talked to, all 36 people, all said the craft was alive, it was conscious. And I just did an interview with Jack Sarfati, who's a famous physicist working on this problem. He claims he's got a Navy witness who ran one of the programs for 4 years and had a craft that he flew the craft. And he said the craft is not only conscious, it has its own will, and it will only allow people into the craft if your mindset is proper. And it sounded like it was at Lockheed. And this matches, if you've heard the interview with the guy who ran the OSAP program, James Lukatsky, talked about this. The fact that we know now for a fact that the craft is conscious, it's part psychic and it's part physical in terms of its propulsion system. And then he added this other aspect that in 2011 they had a meeting in a congressional facility, which tends to indicate some people may be getting briefed. And Senator Reid was there, and he said the meeting had to do with the fact that we'd gotten into one of the crafts, which seemed to confirm Lukatsky's thing that you can't even get in the craft. I mean, the thing won't even let you in, and it has its own free will. In all your witnesses, did you run up against this kind of thing? Because if that's true, if they realize this consciousness connection, which already in 1950 the Canadians said in a memo in 1950, top secret memo, the Canadians their fifth point that they made was they were told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. Now that was before Adamski came forward. That's before anybody talked to an alien. And the only thing that would indicate was that maybe they had a live alien at Roswell and the thing was talking in their head. So in terms of the big people that are maybe running the cover up, have you heard any indications that they're working on this consciousness problem or that they realize the connection?
One of the people that we talked to is Joe McMoneagle, who was deeply involved in the government program using what they termed psychoenergetics at the time. He was remote viewer number one in the Army's program that was being run out of Stanford Research Institute in the 1970s and 1980s. And he said that, this was taken very seriously because of the Russians who were ahead of us, so to speak, in doing some of this work with psychics. But to answer your question, when I first heard of the psionic assets that allegedly are being operated by the United States Air Force, the gentleman Jake Barber came forward and described that he worked in Air Force some covert capacity with the government, that they were actually running psionic assets, doing what essentially is CE5, and that they were successful in this, and that they had actually brought down UAP using these techniques of telepathic or psychokinetic, some type of interaction. In all of the people that we talked to, all of the academic researchers, not once did anyone ever bring up anything like that. So it was when that story came out, I was very curious. I asked a couple of people if they had ever heard of the term psionics, and no one really could bring that forward to say yes. In all of my research in the history of psi phenomena, ESP, and so on, they had never heard of that outside of science fiction, video gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, and so on. Dungeons and Dragons actually has that term within the
right?
part of it. And I think that the term was also used in some science fiction. So it's a very new term. Even if you Google psionics, you won't find it going back very much past 2024. So it's a pretty interesting claim being made that the United States government is actually trying to telepathically communicate with these craft. But Bob, I don't know if you heard of anybody that when we talked to that was specifically saying that the government is currently working on consciousness research.
You
No.
were working with Diane Hennessy Powell. Did she bring up the fact that she's supposedly working with the psionics team?
No,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
Well, in talking to Diane, she totally expressed the work she's doing with autistic children and spectrum children that had exhibited telepathic capabilities. She talked in depth about some of those cases that she was working on in the telepathy tapes and so on, as you talked to them. But I never heard anything about the working with the psionics team. Maybe they recently reached out to her. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, Bob?
Yeah, Graham, we haven't spoken to enough so-called ufologists in the know to get a sense of whether or not consciousness is being studied in a sense as it relates to this phenomenon. Except that, look, that the CIA studied, what's his name, who calls down the orbs in North Carolina.
Chris Bledsoe.
Chris Bledsoe. They tried to get some brainwave patterns on him to see if there's a relationship between intention and the behavior of these UAPs. But we did speak, as Dave said, to Gary Nolan to reflect on what he believes a UAP represented, and he immediately referenced Jacques Vallée's work and the use of the word absurd to describe the phenomenon. And he always said to himself, why does Vallée use the word absurd so often? And then it dawned on him, it's because absurdity is the point. The absurdity is when you finally realize how absurd it is. That's what takes you behind the door, so to speak. I think he said of the Wizard of Oz, and you pull the curtain aside and you realize that you're being manipulated. Not the people to whom it occurred, but to the observer on the outside. And they purposely announce themselves to you in a sometimes a logical way, and oftentimes in an absurd, illogical way, so that you can communicate this message to other people that the phenomenon is real. It begs you to take that 30,000-foot view and to realize that this anomaly is certainly absurd. But in speaking with a leading CIA representative, and I can't recall his name, he's good friends with Ray Hernandez. He believed that Chris Bledsoe was responsible for calling down these orbs. It was him. It reminds me of Massimo Teodorani, the physicist. He and Harvey Rutledge, another physicist, who studied the orbs or the Hasdallan lights. Teodorani did, and he came to the conclusion after a decade of studying it that this phenomenon was communicating with him. It was synchronistic. If it didn't want to be photographed, your camera won't work. It was in control. Now, 2 decades before Teodorani came to that conclusion that there is a consciousness component here, a synchronistic component to these lights, not physical structured craft we're talking about. We're talking about the Hasdallen lights in Hasdallen, Norway. Harvey Rutledge was studying the same lights in Nebraska back in the 80s. He came up with the same conclusion back then. Yet they didn't know each other. They didn't communicate with each other about this. And yet we have two physicists studying the same phenomenon for many years using sophisticated technology, arriving at the same conclusion. Nobody talks about that.
Wow. You mentioned Gary Nolan. I hope you do. Whether you did it in the first, you can maybe bring it up because we should talk about the project that you guys did and who you talked to. But Gary Nolan is one of the people because I had the download experience, so I've written a lot about, and I knew that like Tim Taylor, the guy that from NASA who was following Chris Bledsoe, had a protocol for downloading material, and so did Gary Nolan. I actually asked Gary Nolan if I could quote him on it. He said, "Yeah," and he has this. He said, I don't know if it's elves in my head. I don't know what's going on, but I know how to make it work. And he talked about how he'd work through the whole problem. And then he would just sort of shut down the left brain. He would just say, okay, that's it. And put the piece of paper with the question beside the bed. And he said either the next morning or within the next couple of days, the answer would be in his head. And so you see this, these guys working on this sort of stuff. So let's go through a little bit of the highlights of the people that you talk to and what people would find important in here in terms of what you guys discovered about the importance of consciousness and how it all fits in.
The topic, the consciousness connection, really is coming in some ways from people that don't have a lot of background in this heady sort of topic. Someone like me who didn't really know that science in general doesn't really know what consciousness is, and that the leading consensus seems to be wrong based on some of the research that is being done. And we started with that premise. Okay, let's try to ask academics what they believe. And we went to the ones that are trying to do experiments, the ones that are trying to think outside the box and come up with ideas that could possibly explain what is really going on and why the brain as the seat of consciousness doesn't seem to be working. It doesn't seem to be an electrochemical process in the neurons. And, Gary Nolan says that right in the beginning of our film. So that's the first step, is to kind of try to talk a little bit about, what do scientists think consciousness is? And we've quickly realized that there's this really big division of camps. You have the materialists that believe that consciousness is derivative of physical matter, that there's nothing besides physical matter. So it has to be something that is a process within our organic beings, and then on the flip side, you have idealism. And idealism is a metaphysical concept that consciousness is primary. Consciousness comes before physical reality. And so that concept seems to be something that's really worth looking into. So then we begin exploring that in an academic setting and also people that have had personal experiences. And we talked to people around the United States that are experts in these fields. We went to the Institute of Noetic Sciences out in California, where some young scientists are actually doing research into precognition, or trying to measure people's ability to react physically to events in the future. And we got to film some of that, and it's fascinating. This young man that developed a driving simulation system that integrates with virtual reality, and then the participants observe a car driving with randomized collisions or accidents, and they don't know that these things are going to happen, but our brain seems to react in advance of the event, which is just fascinating. So there's people that are asking these questions, and We went to the Rhine Institute, and we went into one of their laboratories where a gentleman named Ed Edwards seems to have a very interesting ability to generate energy. And they're able to measure this in what they call their bioenergy laboratory that measures photon emissions, or very weak light energy. So it's not the type of light that you can see with your eyes. It's in the ultraviolet, and it's very, very weak. But they have a blacked out room with a very sensitive piece of scientific equipment that can measure like 1 photon per minute or per second in this room. And when Ed goes in at will, he can start generating these bio-photon emissions. And most people can't do it. It's basically background. If you go in there and you sit down, it's just normal energy that I think all living things have this ability to, and science doesn't know why. We actually don't have too many clues as to what biophotonic energy is for. But Ed goes in there, and we film this in real time with spiking up to like, 90 to 100, hundreds of biophotons. And we're just filming this in real time with Ed in this room, and, kind of shaking our heads based on the baseline of like 4 or 5. Now, what does that mean? We don't really know. And I don't think the scientists have a great understanding yet, but is this somehow related to psychic phenomena? Because the mechanism of, say, telepathy, for instance, is not understood, and it doesn't seem to be magnetic. It's not electromagnetic. You can block all these things out with shielding, and it still occurs. So that's one of the fascinating things is, let's just establish that ESP is real. Telepathic communication is real. Psychokinesis is real. If you start just say, okay, let's say it's real, let's start looking at how it could possibly work. And that's the real challenge that we kind of came up upon, is that mainstream academic science does not accept that ESP is real. And they're going to fight you every step of the way for funding, for grants, and you're going to be drummed out of university departments. And that's really what's happened over the last, 100 years or so. Unfortunately, that's the case. But if you establish which I believe the scientific evidence to the credibility of the reality of psi is there, then you go to the next step and start saying, well, what could these aspects be? Maybe if we start understanding that, we could get closer to understanding what phenomena such as the UAP experience is with telepathic communications with non-human intelligence. We could start looking at what are some of the realities that perhaps the survival of our consciousness in death and possible communication with our souls or entities that are no longer in the physical plane of reality. So you have to start accepting that first. So our film sets some foundations really for anybody. The layperson can watch this film, and even if you don't know anything about, ESP or psi or consciousness, you're going to come away thinking, this message is something that everyone should know about, because it's been sort of repressed by science and mainstream in general. But it's a really hopeful and inspiring message that everyone should know about.
Yes, and our film, which people can watch through a free trial on Gaia by going to consciousness.media, consciousness.media, will take them to that 7-day free trial period to watch our film, The Consciousness Connection. And Dave makes some excellent points. You can make a case that human beings are light beings. We kind of joke around and say we're light energy, light beings. Well, you can make a case for that because biophotons, or ultra weak photonic light emissions, have been found to emanate from DNA, from cells, and are modified based on emotions and other variables. And with each biophoton is a torsion wave. In other words, this torsion wave can carry it's a carrier wave, in other words, for biophotons that might allow, theoretically, might allow for this interchange, ESP, between individuals, and on a much larger scale. But you can make the case that people can manipulate photonic emissions like Ed Edwards did at the Rhine Research Center in the biogenetics lab, where some people can modify their own biophotons, and it's generated in the brain. That's where we start to really get, that's what really turns me on, since my background is brain science, because we see biophotons being generated by the cytoskeleton of neurons in the brain, the architecture of the cells, the walls of the cells. And light energy emanates from that beyond the body, and theoretically can be picked up by other bodies, almost like a transmission receiver kind of apparatus. And it's measurable. It's measurable. Now we need to measure these biophotons during these interactions with UAPs to see if there is any kind of possible relationship between that and this phenomenon. Just to rule it in or rule it out. How else can you explain ESP and other kinds of extraordinary human experiences that are unconventional in explanation? But when you start looking at this biophotonic energy, and even Diane Hennessy Powell, Tom Campbell, and many others even go beyond that, thinking that we live in a simulation, a virtual reality, and our bodies are actually an avatar acting in it as a computer. Now, did that relate to biophotonic energy? I don't know. I don't know. But you have this whole range of wild theories, which I shouldn't say are wild, but are unconventional. Let's put it that way. They're not accepted within academia, although there is strong evidence in terms of quantum physics for its existence and to help explain much of the phenomena that we encountered in our discussions with people in our documentary, in ESP and near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. Look, Bob Monroe logged in great detail all of his out-of-body experiences where he entered other dimensions, interacted with other beings, deceased individuals, to the point where he had great control over it, all by trying to just study how best to help people sleep, trying to simulate brainwave patterns of sleep. That was his primary goal. And in the process, he, as Dave mentioned, has an out-of-body experience and takes it 10 steps further, where he's now entering other alternate realms and interacting with all other beings.
You think this might
That was, I was going to say too, that's a huge part of the film. Something that I wanted to do, Grant, was tell that story, that it really hasn't been told about Bob Monroe and what he did. So maybe 30 minutes of the film, almost a third of the film, is dedicated to telling a pretty detailed history of Bob Monroe and his initial days of forming the Monroe Institute of Art and Science, and going forward from there to establishing the Monroe Institute as we know it today. So from 1973 to today, right now, people are exploring consciousness there. So they're not necessarily held back by this rigid academic stigma. And the Institute allows anybody like you and I to participate and become consciousness explorers in our own right from your own home. Or you can go there, and there's residential programs where you can also explore this. They have lots of programs geared towards people to help them from all walks of life. They're teaching people. You and I talked a little bit about energy medicine before we started. They're exploring that. Reiki therapy and people that want to go into those healing arts. They're still teaching the very first Bob Monroe Gateway program, how you can slowly begin to learn to explore this out-of-body state. And you don't have to necessarily go out of body. You can also use it just to learn how to enter into a state of consciousness that is pretty much like sleeping while you're awake, waking dreams, so to speak, using hemispheric sync, which is the audio technology that Bob Monroe first discovered, along with Tom Campbell and Dennis Menarak back around 1973. And this was like a random scientific article that they came across, and they started to implement that. And it's still in use today in Monroe Sound Science, where using some headphones, you can stimulate your brain rhythm, so to speak, to kind of induce your brain to move into a mode that simulates a deep relaxation in theta waves mixed with alpha waves that then allow you to retain memory of what you're observing. So it's a way that everyone can become a consciousness explorer and do some research on their own.
Yeah. And if you look at the CIA files, you see Monroe Institute referenced numerous times. So they were taken kind of seriously by people who were in that field.
That's right.
So
Exactly, Grant. The CIA required their personnel to purposely go to the Monroe Institute to try to learn how to achieve an out-of-body state. What better way to spy than to do it from your office in the Pentagon, rather than spending millions of dollars with advanced technology trying to, like Joe McMoneagle. He identified the Russian submarine that was unclassified,
yeah.
unknown.
Yeah.
And Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, was spending millions of dollars trying to come to this realization when Joe McMoneagle did so on his own using remote viewing. And kiddingly, he would always say to the Secretary of Defense, "Hey, how's your research coming along?" And to which he would receive a sneer in response. So I think the biggest message Dave and I got from interviewing these experts in this area of ESP and near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, that the phenomenon of human consciousness is not confined to the brain. It's part of a larger interconnected system. And we're talking about quantum mechanics, and we can't say everything is answerable by quantum mechanics. But the more research that's done in quantum mechanics, the more it is proven to be valid. Entanglement is real. Non-locality is real. And based on entanglement and non-locality, we can use those principles to explain much of the phenomenon that we're talking about. And it also interrelates with the UAP, let alone ESP and near-death experience. So, suggesting that consciousness operates on a level that transcends traditional physical boundaries, but we don't understand quantum mechanics well enough to apply it to prove conclusively that entanglement and non-locality exist, that are operational, that can be manipulated, and that can lead to a paradigm shift. It is a paradigm shift. I'm not talking about the sun being the center of our galaxy in a sense, but we're talking about a remarkable finding maybe of that magnitude, indicating that people have a lot more ability, power, intention, and control over their lives if their behavior is modified, trained, facilitated from early on in life as much as possible, whereby we can use these principles of entanglement and non-locality to develop ESP. to develop our consciousness for the benefit of humans and society overall.
Wow. Now, McMonagle had a near-death experience, and Jacques Vallée has just been interviewed a few times on his new journal that he put out, and he talks about the experience where he's out of his body and he suddenly runs into a being. So you see these crossovers where people get involved in the phenomena. They may have one sighting, and then all this other weird stuff happened. Did you guys have that in terms of your documentary, in terms of weird stuff happening, synchronicities, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we did for sure. And the other thing that was pretty interesting is a lot of the people that we talked to, we would find out, that they also had UFO sightings.
Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't the first thing we were talking to them about, but they kind of understood that we were interested in that, and they said, "Hey, by the way, I want to tell you about this sighting." So we collected some really interesting UFO reports. Joe McMonagle goes into great detail about his sighting experience in the 60s when he was in the Army during the Vietnam War period. And I always think, is there a correlation between those experiences and then later in life when they become kind of involved in these other types of psychic events and interest in that? Same with Dr. Gary Nolan. He told us of his experience as a paperboy, as a teenager in his hometown, walking through the woods and encountering a huge craft above him. Did that have some bearing, on his future interest in the subject? Obviously, it probably did. So yeah, that was a lot. Now, do you remember some of those synchronicities, Bob, that may have occurred?
Oh, you and I have had so many synchronicities, I can't keep track of it, um, uh, in many ways, I wish I could recall them specifically at this point in time.
A lot of times, when I'm working on a film, I'm so involved in the very minute topics and details. And what I find happens is material emerges to me. It'll come to me and present itself organically, but it will be so profound. And it'll be, archival material of Bob Monroe stating a specific thing. And out of, dozens and dozens of hours of material where he's talking at conferences and, just one like little thing. And I'm like, how did that happen? I don't know if I was involved in that or something, some other force was involved in that. And that it's not just sound and video, it could be documents. A document will come to me and I'll be, this is the thing that I was looking for. I can't believe out of millions and millions of web pages and so on that this little piece. And so when I'm putting the material together, I just can't believe that I have all of this stuff that fits a story that maybe we have no visual for, or maybe there's very little background data. A good example of that would be discovering the Ed May archives at Rice University. And there's boxes and boxes of material that Ed May donated. He was one of the principal investigators and runners of the Stargate program. So he had a lot of material on Stargate and remote viewing that he donated to Rice University. And we kind of randomly discovered that there was all these videos. And not only are these, because sometimes it's just in some dusty banker's box in a closet somewhere, getting that onto the web is almost impossible. But they had this stuff and we didn't even have, I don't know, we didn't really have to pay for it, right? But it was sort of like they just helped us out and said, they sent us like gigabytes of video. And so there was stuff like that once we had the intention, then that material came back to us. Same with actually getting the commission to have this film finished. We had been working shoestring, crowd-funded for like 4 years, and we didn't know how we were going to finish the film. And it just kind of walked through the door and said, "Here you go, fellas. now you can finish the film. And not only that, we'll put it on our network that has over 800,000 subscribers. So, I mean, it was pretty amazing that whole last year.
Wow. So you've got a lot of material. You mentioned before we started, you got a lot of material. Maybe talk a little bit about your upcoming things you want to do in your next documentary, stuff that you won't be in this documentary, but you're hoping to bring into the future projects.
Well, we're talking about the possibility of focusing more on the near-death experience. We covered some of that in our first film on consciousness.media, where you can watch the film.
Yeah.
But vertical perceptions and near-death experiences are probably the most significant pieces of evidence that proves that there is a continuation of consciousness after bodily death. You know, it was a story that Dr. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist and leading NDE researcher, shared with us, and if my memory serves me right, it goes something like he was interviewing a patient who had severe lung problems, and his nurse Anita had to leave for the weekend, and Anita said to the patient Jack, "I'm going to have another nurse here, and but to take care of you, I'll be back on Monday." While she's gone, he has a respiratory event. He has a near-death experience, and in his near-death experience, he sees Anita. Anita comes towards him and says, "Jack, I want you to go back and tell my parents I love them very much and that I'm sorry that I wrecked the red MGB." The red MGB. And this was in the 70s in South Africa, where there were hardly any red MGBs at the time. Well, when he wakes up, when he recovers, obviously, from his NDE, he tells the first nurse he sees about his interaction with Anita, and what she told him. And the nurse began to cry and ran out of the room. Jack later then found out that Anita did spend the weekend with the parents to celebrate her 21st birthday, was given a red MGB for her birthday present, which she took for a test drive, crashed it into a tree, and died immediately at the same time that Jack had his near-death experience.
Yeah.
So there's no way that he knew that how could he have known that she died and how she had died. And that story, if I had told it correctly, my memory serves me right, convinced Bruce Grayson that this is something that he needs to research further, that these vertical perceptions, verifiable perceptions, where accurate details of events are confirmed by another party, happen. They're rare in occurrence, but they're jewels of research in NDEs. And there's many examples of it. And I could go on and on about it. People should write a book about it. And I encourage people to get on the Near Death Experiencer Research Foundation website, run by Dr. Jeffrey Long, who is also in our documentary, because a lot of people talk about their vertical perceptions that they have during their NDEs, and there's thousands of anecdotal accounts of NDEs on that website, nderf.org.
And you wrote a book on near-death experiences, right?
Me? Oh, well, Life After Death, which certainly involves near-death experiences, as well as this new book, the Consciousness Connection. There's certainly a lot of
Oh, that's a
information.
light read.
Yeah.
It's only 500 pages, but
Started
it
to write like Ray Hernandez, 800-page books.
beyond UFOs. You know, there's a documentary that's being done on Ray. Did
Oh,
you
yeah.
know that?
No, I didn't know that. Yeah.
about his life and his experience. Um, I'm very curious how that will go, but it talks about the time he was driving his car in Miami, and then the next second he's interacting with an extraterrestrial on board a craft, and his life was changed from that moment forward. And
Yeah.
he encouraged Edgar Mitchell to do that study, convinced him that he would, lead the charge. And I was fortunate to be part of that. After I wrote my book, The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe, Ray contacted me, and I was intrigued by the science of it, the people on board. There were a lot of noted scientists
Yeah.
involved in the study, and that turned me on. And so that made me more interested in consciousness than ever before,
Yeah.
and in a way that I was never would consider. Since I studied the brain, of course, I always looked at it as a state of wakefulness of
Yeah.
varying degrees, not as a form of non-locality and entanglement, and that you could be beamed up on a ship while you're driving a car in Miami. But it should be an interesting story, and I'm curious what that will show.
Well, I think all our stories will sort of 500 years from now, people don't respect it now, but we'll be like living at the time of Christ or something, that these people are so lucky, especially someone like you. You were the first sort of neurologist to sort of jump across the fence. When I remember when I heard you'd come on with the free people, I thought, wow, that's because that's a pretty conservative bunch. And so you made the first move. And I think to me, it's always like we're playing in the Super Bowl, that when you realize how complex this is and what's really going on, you realize we're on the leading edge of something that's going to be a major, major story.
I remember you attended one of our meetings of free. Am I right? You
Uh,
were you were
I'm not sure.
invited.
I met Ray in Florida 2 days before he had that event with the car, because he had the contact and he wanted to know. So he was doing consciousness and he was putting UFOs, and my name came up, and he was so amazed, like he had made this contact outside the house where he's writing the tickets and stuff like that. And that's when I met him. And so to me, it was always a situation where there was a synchronicity between me and Ray, and also Chris Bledsoe, who had his first encounter with the being of light a couple weeks after Ray. They all happened within about a month and a half of each other.
Really?
And it was an important event for me, especially when I
Mhm.
saw the evidence that you guys had collected. And I kept saying to people, like, nobody has a clue. I mean, even the UFO people don't want to read it. They're more into the conspiracies and all that kind of stuff, where the real evidence is when you start talking to the experiencers who have been totally ignored by the UFO. Even you look at Congress, they're not looking at experiencers. They could care less.
Exactly right.
And
Exactly
the
right.
same
And
with
that's
you
the
look at the
frustrating part.
the major documentaries, James Fox, they will not touch experiencers because they don't want to ruin the reputation. It's sort of like, let's prove, or the Soul Conference, where at the Soul Conference they said they're going to leave the woo out. We're going to convince people that there's nuts and bolts and it's for real. Well, you've been doing that for 80 years. You haven't proved anything. You got to start talking to the people who are in contact with whatever this intelligence is.
Yeah, I spoke to people on the Soul Foundation, and they're well aware
Yeah.
of the contact
Yeah. They
experience.
don't deny it. Yeah.
They're believers.
Yeah.
When you talk to them one on one, but they will not in any document, go take that next step and talk about experiencers and the that important aspect of the phenomenon, which they know exists, but because of the stigma associated with it, they think it'll decrease
Yeah.
their credibility if they bring in the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah. It's the
Which is
same as Ions. Ray mentions the story where Ions said that we're supporting you, but we can't be associated with you because we'd lose all our funding.
Well, the thing about consciousness, if you're going to talk about consciousness existing outside of the human body, which I think is a fascinating concept, out of body experience, but the same holds true with telepathy or any of these things. We're talking about some type of energy form that contains our personalities that could exist outside. Now, perhaps the UFO phenomenon represents an aspect of that where we're actually interacting with another form of consciousness that is maybe using some type of technology that can bridge a non-physical dimension and enter into our dimension, but they're using a technology that we don't understand. So when we see it, it seems absurd. You know, that these grays that seem like robots or something, biological robots that may be vessels that consciousness can exist within. I mean, maybe that's what we are, vessels that consciousness can exist within. So maybe we're looking at some type of metamorphosis of ourselves. So in looking at the UFO phenomenon, we're actually looking into a different version of ourselves. That's something that Whitley Strieber comes back to again and again. And he always uses the example of a caterpillar looking at a butterfly, saying, does the caterpillar realize that that's, you know, a future version of itself when we're looking at an interaction with a non-human intelligence, even a non-human biological intelligence that seems to be involved in these contact cases. There's a component of our own consciousness and this other consciousness, which seem to be, if you take away the physical aspects of it, the consciousness seem to have some of the similar interactions that we do. Concerns about the environment, for instance, imparting knowledge, scientific information, downloads. It's not hugely alien to us. So there's a lot of evidence there that maybe we're looking at something that is a future version of ourselves. I don't know.
Dave, you're exactly right. You know, we had a subset population of the 3,200 people. We had something like 1,200 people who said yes to the question, did you receive any type of communication from a non-human intelligence? And 83, 84, 5% said yes. And they claimed that the messages that they received were generally reassuring messages, spiritual messages, messages of love or of oneness, in the majority of them. I'm trying to remember, about 1/3 said they received information about parallel universes, the concepts of time,
25%
messages about
reincarnation.
God or a creator. Yeah, but using, of course, you know, two-way telepathy.
Yeah.
But yeah, the more I studied that, the more I read some people in the literature, not many. It's clearly a non-physical phenomenon, something you're not going to see in any congressional hearing or whistleblower testimony.
Yeah.
You're going to get anything else but that aspect of the phenomenon, which is, in my mind, the most important, significant aspect of the phenomenon, the non-physical thought, voice download from non-human intelligences to people.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you guys are at the leading edge of this because, as I mentioned before the show, when I heard that the telepathy tapes had gotten 1.5 million listens on Christmas Day, we have sort of this may be our 15 minutes of fame to make our mark. And I'm glad you guys are on the leading edge because I know, because I've worked on this since 2012 when I had my download experience about consciousness. And I know this is, it's moving, but not very fast in terms of, this is the big thing that's maybe behind it. And the UFO community really isn't paying attention. So I'm glad that you guys are on the forefront of what is the most important issue facing the research of paranormal phenomena. And I'm grateful you're doing it. And anytime you want to review stuff, new material you've got, let's talk it up. And because the more we talk, the more consciousness rises, and the more people are going to realize that, almost like Max Planck said, you don't win by convincing your opponent he's wrong. You win when your opponent dies. And one funeral at a time, the new generation is not offended with the idea. So the more we talk about it, the more the young people will just say, well, of course this is real. Of course this is real. They're not going to deny it. So we have to do our part. And I appreciate the fact that you guys are doing it, where it takes some money and it takes a lot of planning to put together a documentary, and I really appreciate you guys doing this.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
very
let's get this out there. I mean, it really is difficult, and getting it distributed out to as many eyeballs as possible, because really that's in the end what Bob and I wanted to do, is get this message out there, let people start thinking about it, and maybe, you know, giving people hope that life isn't just birth to death and then disintegration, that's not the true nature of consciousness. And that I think that that's the message that our film has. So, you know, again, it's on Gaia.com now, but we are definitely actively trying to find other distribution methodologies to get this out to more people.
Beautiful. I'll do whatever I can to help you, and let's do this again sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Grant.
Good.
Namaste. Pleasure to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure.
Been a pleasure.